The first time Clara Whitmore heard the words, "I need a mother for my boys," she thought she must have misheard him. Because men did not say such things out loud. Not like that, not with a voice as cold and steady as the winter wind that swept across the Montana plain. She stood on the far side of the ranch gate, her gloved hands clasped tightly in front of her, the last of her savings stitched into the lining of her coat, her pride held together by little more than habit and hope. Across from her stood Caleb Hart, broad-shouldered, weather-worn, his hat casting a shadow over eyes that had clearly learned long ago not to ask the world for mercy. The mountains rose behind him like silent witnesses, and the ranch stretched wide and empty, the kind of place that swallowed loneliness whole and still wanted more. Clara had come to ask for work, any work at all, and instead she was being offered something that sounded like a transaction but felt dangerously close to fate. Caleb did not look at her the way men in town did, with curiosity or hunger or pity. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he has already decided must be solved, no matter the cost. He told her he had 2 boys, young but old enough to feel the sharp edge of loss, old enough to notice the empty space where a mother should be. He said the house was too quiet, that the boys needed structure, schooling, warmth, and a woman's steady presence. He said he did not have time for courtship or romance or dreams. What he needed was simple: a wife in name, a mother in duty, a teacher in practice. His voice never wavered, but his hand tightened on the wooden gate as if even saying the words cost him more than he wanted her to know. Clara felt her heart pound so loudly she was sure he could hear it. Only weeks ago she had been dismissed from the schoolhouse after the funds ran dry, her position cut like a luxury no one could afford. She had buried her parents the year before, one after the other, and learned how quickly a woman could become invisible when she had no husband, no family, no money. She had walked for miles with blistered feet and stubborn resolve, telling herself that dignity mattered, that she would not beg. Yet now, standing before this man with his blunt proposal and his guarded eyes, dignity felt like a fragile thing, easily shattered by hunger and cold and fear of what tomorrow might bring. She told him she was not that kind of woman, not someone to be bought or hired like a farmhand. Her voice trembled despite her effort to keep it steady. Caleb listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, as if he had expected resistance and accepted it as part of the cost. When she finished, he nodded once, and said quietly that he was not offering romance, nor ownership, nor affection he could not promise. He was offering security, a roof that did not leak, food that did not run out, a place where she could teach again, where her skills would matter. He said she could leave any time she wished. He would not stop her, but until then the boys would have a mother, and she would have a future. The wind carried the distant sound of children's laughter, faint but unmistakable. Clara turned her head and saw 2 small figures near the barn, one chasing the other, their coats too thin for the season, their joy sharp and fleeting like sunlight through clouds. Something inside her shifted then, something she had guarded fiercely since the world began taking things from her. She had loved teaching because it meant shaping young minds, giving them something solid to stand on. She had loved children because they believed in tomorrow even when adults no longer could. The thought of walking away, of letting someone else step into that space, felt suddenly heavier than the risk of staying. Caleb watched her struggle in silence. He did not move closer. He did not soften his tone or sweeten his offer. Whatever warmth he had was buried deep, sealed behind responsibility and grief. Clara sensed that he too had lost something essential, that the ranch was not just land but a refuge he had built against sorrow. When she finally met his gaze again, she saw not cruelty but exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying everything alone for too long. She asked him what happened to the boy's mother. His jaw tightened, just briefly, before he answered. Illness, quick and unforgiving. He said her name once, softly, like a prayer he no longer believed would be answered. Clara felt the sharp sting of shared loss, though their griefs wore different faces. In that moment, the proposal no longer sounded cold. It sounded desperate. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in bruised purples and golds. Clara realized that night would come soon, and she had nowhere else to go. The town was miles away, and even there kindness was a limited resource. She thought of the school books she had carried for years, of the lessons she still wanted to teach, of the children who might one day thank her without knowing how close she had come to disappearing. She thought of herself, standing at the edge of a choice that could either save her or break her. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet but firm. She said she would consider it on her terms. She would teach the boys properly. She would be treated with respect. This would not be servitude, nor silence, nor a prison dressed up as charity. Caleb studied her for a long moment, then nodded. He said those terms were fair. He said he did not want obedience, he wanted stability, for them all. As he opened the gate and gestured for her to come inside, Clara felt the weight of the decision settle into her bones. This was not love. Not yet. It was an agreement forged out of necessity, loneliness, and unspoken hope. But as she stepped onto the ranch, the boys' laughter growing louder, she wondered if something stronger than either of them intended was already beginning to take root. Chapter 2. By the second morning on the Hart Ranch, Clara Whitmore learned that silence could be louder than any argument. The house greeted her before dawn with a stillness so complete it pressed against her ears, broken only by the soft creak of settling wood and the distant low of cattle waking to the cold. She rose quietly from the narrow bed Caleb had insisted was hers, smoothing her dress as if order alone might anchor her in this unfamiliar life. There was no ring on her finger, no ceremony to mark what she had agreed to, yet the weight of it followed her down the hall and into the kitchen like a shadow that refused to leave. She found the boys already there, sitting stiffly at the table, their faces wary, eyes flicking toward her and then away, as though she were a visitor who might vanish if stared at too long. The older one, Thomas, had his father's serious gaze and the guarded posture of a child who had learned not to expect much. The younger, Eli, clutched a chipped mug with both hands and watched her openly, curiosity warring with suspicion. Clara smiled, gentle but not forced, and introduced herself the way she always had in a classroom, her voice warm, her words steady. She told them she was there to help, to teach, to make sure they were fed and cared for. She did not say the word mother. It felt too heavy, too sacred to be spoken so soon. Eli nodded solemnly, as if filing her away in his small understanding of the world. Thomas said nothing, but she noticed the way his shoulders loosened just a fraction. Caleb entered as she was setting porridge on the table, his presence filling the doorway without announcement. He paused when he saw her there, moving confidently through the kitchen as though she belonged, and something unreadable crossed his face. He thanked her once, quietly, and sat with the boys, the four of them bound together by an agreement none of them fully understood. Breakfast passed with few words, but Clara sensed the fragile balance forming, the unspoken test each of them was conducting. When she spoke to the boys about lessons after chores, Caleb looked up sharply, surprised, before nodding his approval. It was the first time she saw him relinquish even a small measure of control. The day unfolded with the rhythm of ranch life, relentless and honest. Clara helped where she could, her hands unused to the weight of buckets and the bite of cold water, yet she did not complain. The boys watched her closely, Eli offering shy assistance, Thomas observing with a thoughtful intensity that made her wonder how much he saw. By midday, when lessons began at the kitchen table, something remarkable happened. The boys leaned in, they asked questions, they argued over answers and laughed when she corrected them gently. The house, once so quiet, began to breathe again. Caleb watched from a distance, pretending to mend tack while listening to the sound of his sons learning, their voices alive in a way he had not heard since before sickness stole their mother from them. He told himself this was practical, necessary, that Clara was fulfilling her role exactly as agreed. But when he caught himself standing still, simply listening, he felt something shift deep in his chest, something dangerously close to relief. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and the boys slept curled under heavy blankets, Clara stood at the window, staring out at the endless land. She felt the ache of exhaustion in her bones, and the unfamiliar comfort of purpose warming her from the inside. Caleb joined her, keeping a careful distance, as if proximity itself might break whatever fragile order they had built. He told her the boys had not laughed like that in a long time. The admission was quiet, almost reluctant, but it carried more weight than any grand declaration. Clara nodded, unsure what to say, aware of the thin line they walked between necessity and something more dangerous. This was still an arrangement. Still temporary, she reminded herself. And yet, as she prepared for bed, she realized she was no longer counting the hours until morning with dread. She was planning lessons, imagining futures, wondering, against her better judgment, what kind of man Caleb Hart might be beneath the armor he wore so well. Chapter 3. The third week on the Hart Ranch arrived quietly, disguised as routine. But Clara Whitmore felt the change before she could name it, as if the air itself had shifted and settled into something less hostile, less watchful. The boys now greeted her in the mornings without hesitation, Eli racing into the kitchen with stories that tumbled over each other, Thomas lingering just long enough to ask questions he pretended were only about lessons but were really about the wider world he had begun to imagine again. Clara taught them reading and sums, but she also taught them how to ask, how to wonder, how to speak without fear of being dismissed. She noticed how often Caleb paused near the doorway, pretending to look for something while listening to her voice steady their lives. And though he said little, his presence felt less like supervision and more like quiet gratitude he did not yet know how to express. One evening, a storm rolled in without warning, the sky darkening until the mountains disappeared behind sheets of rain. Thunder rattled the windows, and Eli woke screaming from a nightmare he could not explain. Clara reached him before Caleb did, instinct guiding her steps, and gathered the trembling child into her arms. She rocked him softly, murmuring reassurances she remembered from her own childhood, words that had once saved her when the world felt too large and cruel. When Caleb entered the room and saw his son clinging to her, his small fingers knotted in her sleeve, he froze. For a moment he looked like a man witnessing something sacred he had not dared hope for again. Thomas stood in the doorway, watching, his face unreadable. Clara caught his eye and held out her free hand. After a brief hesitation, he crossed the room and took it, his grip tight and uncertain. The storm raged outside, but inside the room, something settled into place. Caleb did not interrupt. He simply stood there, rain dripping from his coat, realizing that the woman he had hired out of necessity had become something far more dangerous to his carefully ordered world. Later, after the boys slept soundly, Clara and Caleb sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the storm's aftermath echoing in the silence between them. He thanked her again, this time looking directly at her, his voice rough with something unguarded. She told him she had not done anything extraordinary. The children needed comfort, not contracts. The words lingered, challenging the very foundation of their arrangement. Caleb admitted he had been afraid, not just of losing his wife, but of failing his sons afterward, of becoming a man who provided everything except warmth. Clara listened, her heart aching with the knowledge that grief wore many disguises, even strength. That night, as Clara lay awake, she realized the truth she had been carefully avoiding. This was no longer just a place to survive. It was becoming a place she cared about, a place that could hurt her if she allowed it. And somewhere down the hall, Caleb lay staring at the ceiling, aware that the woman sleeping under his roof was changing the rhythm of his life in ways he could not control, nor entirely resist. Chapter 4. The day Clara Whitmore realized the agreement had begun to unravel was the day she heard Thomas call out for her without thinking. He had fallen from the fence while helping his father mend a broken rail, his cry sharp with pain and fear, and before Caleb could reach him, Clara was already running across the yard, her skirts gathered in her hands, her heart pounding as though the boy were her own. She knelt beside him, brushing dirt from his hair, checking his leg with practiced calm while speaking softly, anchoring him to the moment. When Caleb arrived, breathless and pale, he watched her steady his son with the confidence that no contract could explain. Thomas was not badly hurt, only shaken, but he clung to Clara long after the pain faded. Caleb carried him inside, and for the first time since Clara had arrived, he did not hesitate before handing his son over to her. The simple act struck Clara with unexpected force. Trust, she realized, was not granted all at once. It was built in moments like this, quiet and irrevocable. That evening, Clara sat alone on the porch steps as the sun dipped low, her thoughts tangled with emotion she had no right to feel. She reminded herself that this was temporary, that she was here because she needed safety and purpose, not because she was meant to stay. Yet when Caleb joined her, offering a cup of coffee without speaking, the silence between them felt different, weighted but not uncomfortable. He asked her carefully whether she planned to leave once the boys no longer needed her so much. The question startled her. She had not realized he was already thinking of an end. She told him the truth. She did not know. Life had taught her that certainty was a luxury, and she had learned to survive without it. Caleb nodded, staring out at the land as if it might offer answers. He confessed that he had not expected this to be so complicated. He had thought practical needs would keep emotion at bay. Clara almost smiled at the irony. Human hearts, she knew, were never practical. That night, Thomas and Eli asked Clara to read to them before bed. Caleb stood in the hallway, listening as her voice carried through the house, weaving stories of courage and kindness. When the boys drifted off to sleep, she lingered by the door, watching their peaceful faces. The thought of leaving them, of tearing herself from this fragile family, filled her with a grief she had not anticipated. Caleb found her there, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was charged with words unsaid, questions unasked. When he finally thanked her, not for what she did but for who she was, the sincerity in his voice stripped away the last of her defenses. She realized then that she was no longer simply a teacher or a caretaker. She was becoming something far more dangerous, someone who mattered. If you want to see what happens when an arrangement begins to feel like a promise, when a woman who needed a home becomes the heart of one, and when a man who asked for duty finds himself facing desire, stay with this story. Subscribe, follow, and return for the next chapter, because the closer they grow, the harder it will be to pretend this was ever just an agreement.